Before we begin, we'd like to give special thanks to all of our sponsors for helping make this event possible each year. Specifically, thank you to CRL FormFox for being our title sponsor for 5 consecutive years. And thank you to our platinum sponsors, OraSure Technologies, Psychmedics, Samba Safety, UKG, and Quest Diagnostics.
Hi, and thank you so much for joining us for another session of Day with DISA. This session will be on return to duty programs and why they're so important. Today, we're joined by Bill Current, President and founder of the Current Consulting Group, and Yvette Farnsworth Baker, Senior Legal Consultant at Current Consulting Group. Bill, Yvette, how are you guys doing today?
Doing great, Thomas.
Doing really well. Really happy to be here.
Awesome. Well, we're excited to have y'all because this is a topic that's certainly more and more prominent with every year. It seems to get more and more attention. And so it should be very impactful to all of our attendees today. But before we jump into the presentation, I do want to remind everyone that if you have any questions, use the Q&A button at the bottom right of the player. If you have any questions that we're unable to answer today, we will be reaching back out to you after Day with DISA. Additionally, we'll be making a copy of this presentation available for download on the Materials tab at the end of the session. With that being said, Bill, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Thomas. And let me just say at the outset, what a great privilege it is for us at Current Consulting Group to be associated with Day with DISA once again. Over the last several years, Day with DISA has become just one of the premier events in the drug testing industry. And so for Current Consulting Group, it's a real honor to be part of it. So thank you for that. As Thomas mentioned, we're going to talk about why return to duty programs are more important than ever. And I'll be co-presenting today with Yvette Farnsworth Baker, who is our senior legal consultant here at the Current Consulting Group. So our bios are right here at the front of the slide deck. You can take a look at them later at your leisure. And if you have any questions, please let us know. Now, here's the agenda we're going to follow. I'm going to set the stage with some really recent information. I'm going to blend it a little bit with some sort of post-COVID information to sort of set the stage. And then I'll talk about some reasons to drug test. And then Yvette will take us through the whole return to duty issue, second chance agreements, and creating a culture of prevention and rehabilitation. So let's get started with sort of the current state of drug testing and drug abuse in the United States. And it's very important to keep in mind that the federal government puts out reports every year, and they've been doing it for decades, that help measure the magnitude of the drug problem. So some of the statistics we're looking at right now come from the federal government. And the beauty of that is that we're able to compare year by year, decade by decade. So for example, in the first bullet, marijuana use among adults 26 and older increased from 7% in 2002 to nearly 20% in 2020. So that's a dramatic increase, and it coincides directly with the legalization movement in the United States. As more and more states have legalized marijuana, we've seen a dramatic increase in the use of marijuana. And part of it's because the perceived risk of harm, which was always high, has come down. So of those who were interviewed between 2015 and 2020, there was a significant drop from 36% in 2015 to 27% who perceived harm in using marijuana on a weekly basis. So fewer people perceive any harm in using marijuana on a regular basis. Therefore, more people are using marijuana. And as you see in that last bullet, between individuals between 12 and, or I should say, people 12 and older, in the 2020 government report, show that 2.8 million people used marijuana for the first time that year. So a dramatic increase in the number of people who are trying marijuana because the perceived risk of harm is going down. and we're seeing a dramatic increase in marijuana use across all age groups. Now, in addition, there are certain things that are important to understand when it comes to testing for marijuana in the drug testing world. Now, no drug test can actually either legally or scientifically prove that somebody is impaired by any drug. They prove the presence of the drug in someone's system. Typically, like with a urine test, you're identifying a metabolite of marijuana in somebody's system. Not necessarily that they're impaired, but that they have the drug in their system. With oral fluid testing, for example, you can identify the metabolite, but you can also identify the parent drug. That's an important distinction because in many states now that have legalized marijuana, they require employers to show a connection between a positive drug test for marijuana and some other proof of impairment. So you want to document other types of behavior that maybe justifies a reasonable suspicion drug test, for example. And when you do that with oral fluid, you're able to identify the parent drug, which makes it possible to identify marijuana in someone's system within minutes after the individual used the drugs. Whereas with metabolites, it takes several hours, 6, 7, 8 hours before the metabolite becomes detectable in the drug. That's why you're going to see a lot more oral fluid testing, I believe, as we go forward. But as marijuana is legalized, the impairment issue becomes even more important than ever. But keep in mind that no drug testing method, at least up to this point, can legally or scientifically prove that someone's impaired. Now, there are two different windows that we want to look at, the window of impairment and the window of detection. All drug testing methods have a window of detection, a period of time in which the drugs will show up in that sample, whether it's hair, urine, oral fluid, blood, breath, fingernails, etc. So the ability to detect drug use immediately after someone has ingested the drug, like smoking a joint on a lunch break, is very important, especially in these states that have legalized marijuana. So you see to the left of the chart, the chart to the left, to the far left of that chart are the drug testing methods, breath, blood, and oral fluid, which are capable of detecting drugs in someone's system within minutes after they've consumed the drug. With urine, you're going to have a lag time of 6 or 7 hours before the drug becomes detectable because you're detecting the metabolite, as I explained before. But the window of detection is going to go out farther. Now, one of the arguments that the opponents of drug testing make is that with urine, you're detecting drugs in someone's system for hours or for weeks after they've used the drug. In reality, at the cutoff levels that we use, and the federal government has established standard cutoff levels when testing with urine, you're really only going to have a window of detection of about 3, 4, 5 days. It's possible the drug is still detectable in that person's system in their urine sample beyond that, but at the cutoff levels that we're looking at, that we use today, you're really looking at a window of detection of several hours after usage, up to about 4 or 5 days. With oral fluid and blood, you're going to be able to detect the drug in someone's system, marijuana, for example, within minutes after they've ingested the drug. But it's only going to go for, it shows here days, but with marijuana, we're really looking at about 24 hours with oral fluid. Blood, which all the smartest people in our industry, the ones that are much smarter than me, will tell you is the gold standard of testing. Not practical for workplace testing, not really legal in many states for workplace testing, but scientifically the gold standard. And very, very similar to oral fluid. In fact, we could say that oral fluid mimics blood. Breath, on the other hand, which is a relatively new drug testing method, and all of these methods that I'm showing here, including hair on the right, these are all drug testing methods that can detect drugs in someone's system. They don't prove impairment, but they can detect drugs in someone's system. But with breath, you've got the benefit of being able to identify drug use within minutes after somebody's using the drug, but the window of detection is about 2 to 3 hours. So that's an important distinction, because if you look to the right, there's a graphic that shows the window of impairment. Now, about 1.5 years ago, the University of Sydney came out with a report analyzing the results of 80 different studies done all across the globe. And they came to the conclusion that the standard window of impairment from marijuana use is about 3 to 10 hours. In other words, someone can still be impaired from using marijuana during their lunch break for the next several hours. That's an important distinction as well, because if somebody comes back from their lunch break or they show up to work under the influence or impaired by marijuana, they could still be impaired 5 hours, 6 hours, 8 hours later. There's a difference between impairment and intoxication. Somebody's going to feel intoxicated or high from using marijuana for a very short period of time. It depends a lot on how much of the drug was used, the THC level in the drug, how the drug was used, whether it was smoked or consumed like through eating a marijuana-laced brownie. And all of those factors come into play when determining whether or not somebody's still impaired from using marijuana earlier in the day. Another factor is what you're asking them to do. So is somebody impaired from using marijuana to the point where they can't answer the phone? Probably not. But are they still possibly impaired and unable to operate a forklift or drive a delivery van? Very possibly. 6, 7, 8, up to 10 hours after using the drug. So you want to look at drug testing methods that cover that entire window of impairment from marijuana. Urine's a little bit out of the picture because of that lag time where we're waiting for the metabolite to become detectable in the urine sample, whereas with oral fluid and breath, we're able to detect the parent drug. And so that's very important. Now, the only 2 drug testing methods that have been approved by the federal government, so in other words, the federal government has put out written standards for these 2 drug testing methods, are lab-based oral fluid and lab-based urine testing. That's important if the legal defensibility of your program is a high priority for you, and it should be. So there are really 2 drug testing methods that you can rely on that have federal standards in place, written standards. That would be lab-based oral fluid and lab-based urine. Now, thanks to the folks at DISA, this goes back comparing 2019 pre-pandemic to 2020, we're able to see that during that period of time in which people were really struggling with the stress and the anxiety caused by the pandemic, that there was blue being 2019, orange being 2020, there was a significant increase in marijuana use, a slight decrease in cocaine use, but a dramatic increase in the use of opioids, almost 274%, and also a dramatic increase in amphetamine positives from random drug testing. So if you compare the orange bar all the way to the left, marijuana, with the orange bar all the way to the right, amphetamines, you see that for the first time, DISA reports that for the first time ever, and DISA has been around a long time, one of the major drug testing providers in the United States, for the very first time ever, amphetamine positives from random drug testing were higher than marijuana positives. So it's very important when you think about your drug test panel that you don't put all your emphasis on marijuana, because other drugs of abuse like opioids and amphetamines have seen a dramatic increase over the last couple of years. Now, a lot of information on this slide about legal medications, legal substances. So I'm not going to go through, all the different types, but we have seen, as I pointed out on the other chart, a dramatic increase in amphetamine use, but also in opioids, which may be used for pain relief. There are other psychoactive or psycho medications for anxiety, sleep orders, attention deficit disorders, and we're seeing a dramatic increase in these legally available substances. But it comes down to people abusing or misusing those medications, maybe using it longer than medically indicated, or taking higher doses than have been prescribed, or combining them with other drugs that they shouldn't be combining them with. And so as you think about, again, your drug test panel, you want to make sure that you're not just focused on marijuana, that you're taking into account that especially over the last 2 to 3 years, we've seen a dramatic increase in the abuse of other drugs, including otherwise legally prescribed substances. So let's take a minute to talk about the reasons to drug test. Now, I just shared some big statistics with you, but how does that affect the workplace? Well, according to the National Council on Compensation Insurance, 50% of all workers' compensation claims involve substance abuse. So at a time when we're seeing a dramatic increase in the use of marijuana, for example, and more individuals testing positive in random tests for marijuana, amphetamines, and opioids, 50% of all workers' comp claims trace back to substance abuse. We also know from federal government reports that substance abusers in the workplace are 1/3 less productive than their non-drug using coworkers. Absenteeism is affected, turnover is affected. These are all cost factors that come into play when a company is deciding to continue drug testing. There's been a little bit of controversy about that, right? Should we continue to drug test in states that have legalized marijuana? My opinion is absolutely yes, but there's lots of reasons to test for drugs besides marijuana. One big example, we won't again go through all the details, but this from 2016, a very tragic accident involving an Amtrak train where two Amtrak workers were killed very tragically. Over 40 passengers were hospitalized, and the cause of the accident was officially designated as miscommunication. But in post-accident drug tests, the engineer tested positive for marijuana, another worker tested positive for cocaine, and a third person tested positive for opioids. The end result, 2 fatalities, but also over $2 million in estimated damages to track and train. So sometimes, unfortunately, substance abuse in the workplace has very tragic consequences. Lots of times it's just a lack of productivity and individuals not showing up for work or maybe quitting their jobs too soon. There was a government study that showed that the average substance abuser works for 2 or 3 employers in a given year, meaning they don't stay with one employer for very long. And all that expense that went into hiring and training that individual is wasted because now they've gone on to another employer. But sometimes, unfortunately, there's tragic consequences. Now, how much does all of this cost? In a 2020 survey from the University of Chicago, it was determined that one substance abusing employee cost his or her employer over $8,800 a year. And about 15 to 17% of the workforce, according to the National Safety Council, are substance abusers or have a substance abuse disorder problem. So if you take a typical company of 450 employees, that's about 76. We could have gone a little higher, a little lower. That's about 76 of the workers who have a substance abuse problem. And if you multiply that times the average cost of a substance abuser, you can see that the cost is in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. I underscore this just to say that, of course, the loss of life is far more tragic. How do we put a price tag on that? But on a regular day-to-day basis, the lack of productivity, accidents that are caused, turnover, absenteeism, et cetera, adds up pretty significantly when you consider the average cost of a substance abuse in the workplace. is over $8,000. And so with that, let me turn the remainder of the presentation over to my partner here at the Current Consulting Group, Yvette Farnsworth Baker, who's going to talk about the importance of return to duty testing and second chance agreements.
Thank you so much, Bill. I love presenting with Bill. He's such an expert in the industry, and that was just a really great start to talk about return to duty testing, follow-up testing, and second chance agreements. So thank you, Bill. And thank you, DISA, for having me here today. I'm happy to be here talking with you all. So we're just going to start out talking about what return to duty testing is, what are second chance agreements, what is follow-up testing, and what are some of the benefits. So second chance agreements. A second chance agreement happens when an employee has violated a drug testing policy. Usually that means testing positive, but it might be a refusal to test. It might be some other issue with testing or with drug use. But if an employee violates a workplace drug testing policy, an employer could look into the option of a second chance agreement, which would be, instead of terminating employment right off the bat, the employer and the employee come to an agreement on conditions that the employee is going to undertake. And once they complete those conditions, they're allowed to return to work with, again, additional working conditions. These can be individualized to the particular circumstances. Usually this starts out with a substance abuse evaluation by a professional who determines, what kind of substance abuse is involved. Is this a serious addiction? Is this more light recreational use? And what kind of treatment would be appropriate for this individual to get them back on track? So what would happen would be an employee violates a drug testing policy, goes through a substance abuse evaluation, and then the employer comes up with conditions that the employee needs to follow in order to return to the workplace. Perhaps they go through treatment and take a leave of absence from work. And when they return, they are going to be subject to additional testing, which brings us to return to duty testing and follow-up testing. So again, this happens when there's been a drug testing policy violation. Return to duty testing is a drug test that happens before the employee returns to the workplace to make sure that they are drug-free at that point. Then follow-up testing is an increase in testing after that. Usually it's for a stated period of time, maybe for the next 12 months. The employee is going to be subject to testing every month or every other month, in addition to their regular testing, to ensure that they are staying drug-free, that they're following their treatment plan, and that they're staying safe in the workplace. Now, I'm going to give you an example of follow-up testing. Now, the Department of Transportation has rules about follow-up testing and return to duty for regulated employers, but any employee can come up with a policy for returning to duty, second chance agreements, follow-up testing as part of their non-regulated policy. I'm going to give you an example of follow-up testing through the Department of Transportation. And again, for those employers who are not regulated by DOT, this is just an example of what you can do, but I thought it was helpful. So an employee violates a drug testing policy. They go to a substance abuse professional. When they are ready to return to duty in a safety sensitive position, they're required to do a minimum of 6 follow-up tests in the first 12 months after they return to duty. But that, like I said, that's the minimum. The substance abuse professional might recommend that this person be tested more regularly for an additional 60 months, or they might recommend 24 months, 36 months, somewhere in there, 12 months to 60 months of additional testing. And they might say, that first 12 months, it's a minimum of 6 follow-up tests. The substance abuse professional might recommend more than that, or for the years going forward, they might recommend fewer tests, 3 additional tests a year, 4 additional tests a year. Just as recommended by the substance abuse professional. These tests are no notice tests. So they're not random in the sense, usually when we say random, you're taking the whole pool of employees and picking out names at random. This isn't random testing because this employee is always going to be the one up for tests. However, they're not informed on the first of every month you're going to take a test. They're no notice tests. So you might have one January 1st, and then you might have one January 30th or something like that. And the employer can set that schedule. In addition to these follow-up tests, the employee also stays in the random pool. So they're still subject to the other testing that's required by the workplace policy. And this is in addition to that. So that's what we mean by follow-up testing. And there's a little example of how a second chance agreement might work, how some follow-up testing might work. So let's talk a little bit about the benefits to second chance agreements. The first one, the reason I put this first is because I've been hearing this a lot lately, is the ability to retain skilled or trained employees. What I've been hearing the past 2 years is that employers are really concerned about losing employees, especially skilled or trained employees, because the workforce is so tight right now. It's difficult to hire, is what I'm hearing from a lot of employers. They're having trouble getting talent and retaining talent, and they're very concerned about that. They want to drug test, but they also need to have employees in the workforce. So the benefits to a second chance agreement is an employer doesn't have to forego drug testing in order to keep employees. They can continue to drug test, but they can have something in place to try to retain some employees who test positive. Like I have here on the slide, the Society for Human Resources Managers say that a skilled employee's annual earnings are at least a third the cost of replacing them. So it costs like 3 times as much to replace a skilled employee. That's not to say that you want to keep drug abusing employees in your workforce. That's a dangerous gamble. However, a second chance agreement could provide something in between terminating everyone who tests positive and just letting drug use go unchecked in the workplace. Another benefit to second chance agreements is just helping employees overcome substance abuse. I mean, that's like the human element. We're talking about people's lives, and being able to give a hand to an employee who is going through something difficult, who has a problem. I mean, that's a really nice benefit to have. Additionally, some states do require second chance agreements. I've listed just 2 examples being Maine and Vermont. Their state laws require that an employer give an employee the opportunity to take a leave of absence, to go through rehabilitation or treatment, and to come back to the workplace. In Maine and Vermont, you can't fire an employee for a first time positive unless you've given them the opportunity to get some treatment. So that's important to know what the laws are in your state. In addition, it is a really big benefit to foster a culture of honesty and rehabilitation in your workplace. Are you a workplace where employees feel like they need to hide their mistakes? They need to sweep things under the rug. They need to pretend that things are going well, even if they aren't. Or are you going to have a culture in your workplace where employees can admit to mistakes and get help in rectifying problems before they blow up even bigger? And second chance agreements can just be one part of a wider company culture of honesty, rectification, and rehabilitation. So I think that is important to touch on as well. So speaking of creating a culture in a workplace, we're going to talk also about creating a culture, not just of how to deal with problems once they arise, but creating a culture of prevention when we talk about drug use and drug abuse by employees. So the first step is educating employees, and this can have to do with a number of things. First is educating your employees on your policy. What is prohibited conduct? What are your testing requirements and procedures? What are they going to be subject to? What are the consequences and discipline actions that they could face? When employees know and understand, they are much more likely to comply than when it's unclear what is prohibited conduct. How often are they going to be facing drug tests? Are they going to be able to get away with things? When they know that they are going to be subject to testing, when they know what substances they're not permitted to use, you have a lot of employees who will comply. So just educating your employees from the get-go is really important. As well, informing your employees about their rights and responsibilities, and also providing them with alcohol and drug abuse awareness information is really helpful. If you can get them that information to start out with before things become a problem, it really just might save you an employee and save a lot of hurt and harm in the workplace and out. So getting them information on getting help with a substance abuse problem, that's something that you can start out with. When you're giving your employees information about policies, about their requirements and what's prohibited conduct, you should always have them sign that they received that. And that way it's just clear what employees have been informed of what and who's on notice of what, and also can just keep your documentation clear if there's ever a problem in the future. Speaking of education, I really feel strongly that employers really need to be very clear with their employees about their marijuana policies. There is a lot of confusion out there amongst everyone about what is prohibited conduct with marijuana and what is not. There are a lot of people who will believe that if marijuana becomes legalized in their state through one way or another, whether it's medicinal marijuana or recreational marijuana, that then they're free to use without consequences. That might not be your workplace policy. If you prohibit recreational marijuana use, but your employees don't know that, you are going to end up with a lot of problems. So you need to be very clear with your employees about what your marijuana policy is. Now, before you can be very clear with them about what your marijuana policy is, you need to be very clear about what your policy is. There's a lot of employers who don't have a marijuana policy and aren't even sure how they can and want to deal with marijuana use by employees. So, number one, you need to know what the laws are in the states in which you operate, because that has a big impact on what your policy can be. So educate yourself on what the laws are in the states, and don't just pick one state. If you operate in multiple states, you need to know what the laws are in each of those different states and make sure you're complying with the state laws of all the places in which you operate. And then decide, once you know what you can do, what you want to do with marijuana use. So if your policy is that no marijuana use is permitted by any employees, medicinal or recreational use, they need to understand that very clearly. If your policy is that registered medical users can get an accommodation, but recreational use is not permitted, you need to make that clear, and you need to make clear to employees using medicinally that they need to have a valid certificate from a doctor or whatever the requirements are from that state in order to receive an accommodation. So there's a lot that goes into a marijuana policy, and your employees really need to be clear on that, and it's going to prevent a lot of problems, a lot of confusion, and a lot of positives coming down the pipe that maybe did not need to be positives. Education and prevention is just so much better than dealing with the consequences of a positive test. And really quickly, I do want to bring up CBD as well, because CBD is widely legal throughout states. And while CBD is not itself a intoxicating substance or even a dangerous substance, CBD is made from cannabis. And what a lot of people don't realize is that CBD products often do contain THC. Now, THC is the substance, the chemical in marijuana that is intoxicating, that causes the high. A person might use CBD medicinally and are not wanting or intending to get high, but they don't realize that the product that they're using also contains THC. Sometimes it's labeled even as no THC, but because of the lack of federal regulation and even the lack of state regulation with CBD products, they could be using something that says 0% THC and it could have THC. And what that means is someone might be using something that they think is innocuous, and they might be coming into the workplace impaired or bringing something into the workplace that's impairing, and they might be testing positive on a drug test for THC without realizing that this is coming from their CBD. So employers need to educate themselves. Employers need to educate their employees about these substances, and I include CBD in all this with prevention and education as being very important to prevent problems. So like I've mentioned, it's so important to have a policy. Before, I maybe should have put this at the beginning, because before an employer can really educate their employees, they need to educate themselves and make sure that they have a complete and clear and up-to-date policy. The National Safety Council shows that about 81% of employers' policies are incomplete. Many employers don't know what to do with marijuana and don't have a clear policy about how they're going to treat medical marijuana or recreational marijuana. A lot of policies don't discuss prescription drug usage. Now, some prescription drug usage is going to be completely innocuous in the workplace, and some is going to be very, very impairing. So an employer needs to be clear about what they want to do with prescription drug usage by employees that is impairing. A lot of policies do not discuss a plan for employees who have performance declines due to drug use. An interactive process for employees who may have disabilities who are using impairing substances as part of their disability treatment, return to work policies. To me, the one I see the most often is employers not dealing with marijuana in the right way. So that's important to make sure you're covering. And then, as we've talked about, second chance agreements, return to work policies, follow-up testing, put this all in your policy. Think it all through ahead of time. What is the plan? What are we going to do? That's going to prevent a lot of mistakes and problems when you suddenly get faced with an issue. So put this all in your policy, think it all through ahead of time, consult with professionals, figure out what the laws are, what's permissible in your state, put it all down in writing, and then educate your employees about that. Make sure that they've received copies of a written policy and that they're aware. That's going to be much better than dealing with positive tests down the road and trying to figure out what to do with them then. In addition to just having a policy, we see a lot of employers who spend a lot of money and a lot of time to get a really great policy, and then they throw it in a desk drawer and they don't look at it for another 10 years, and they don't keep it up to date. It's really important to revisit your policy at regular intervals to make sure it's up to date. The laws, state laws change a lot. We're even seeing federal laws changing now. Bill had mentioned, the addition of lab-based oral fluid in federal guidelines. The federal government is updating their standards and allowing oral fluid testing for federally regulated employers, and states are constantly changing their laws. State laws about marijuana and CBD are changing very quickly, and you need to make sure that your policy is up to date with the changes in laws. And when you make a change to your policy, you need to make sure that your employees are aware of what changes you've made, that they're informed and educated on the changes. And even if you decide that you don't need to make any changes to your policy, it's great to periodically remind your employees of what the policy is. Maybe they received a copy of the policy when they first started at the workplace, but they're receiving a barrage of information on that day, and it slipped their mind very quickly because how to do their job really took precedence in their mind. It's great to remind them of what your policy is. And as laws change in the state, perhaps you're in a state where a marijuana law has changed and your policy is not going to change, but your employees might not understand that. For example, in Mississippi in 2022, they passed a law that legalizes medical marijuana. However, the law does not require employers to accommodate medical marijuana. So an employer might say, okay, Mississippi's law changed. However, we still are not going to accept medical marijuana as a reason for a positive drug test. So our policy is staying the same. Inform your employees about that. Send out an email, send out a notice saying, we realize that the state law has changed about medical marijuana. However, we want to reiterate that our workplace policy has not changed. And that way everyone is on the same page. Everyone is clear. Again, like I talked about with CBD or other substances, maybe there's talk of legalizing them. Make sure your employees know what your policy is, and if it hasn't changed, let them know that so that they're clear. I think that is the end of our slides, so I'm going to send this back to Thomas for some questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bill. Thank you, Yvette. All right, well, want to be respectful of your time. We've got a couple quick questions that we want to dive into. If we're unable to answer your specific question today, don't worry. We'll be taking all of the unanswered questions, working with Bill and Yvette to get answers and kicking those back to you guys next week. So first question that I have here is, can I still test employees for marijuana if recreational marijuana is legal in their state of employment?
Well, the simple answer to that is yes. The only state that prohibits testing for marijuana is New York. And there's even some loopholes in the New York law for, say, reasonable suspicion scenarios, or maybe even post-accident. But even in states that have legalized recreational marijuana, not all of them, but many of them include specific workplace-related language that underscores employers' rights to continue to maintain a drug-free workplace. They don't all go into drug testing specifically, but they usually will reiterate an employer's right to prohibit employees from bringing marijuana to work, using marijuana at work, or being impaired by marijuana on the job.
Gotcha. How is drug abuse costing employers so much money? I know you quoted, I think it was $8,700 a year for a drug abusing employee.
Yeah, and the fact of the matter is that, one vehicle-related accident is going to cost an employer $70,000 on average, according to one report. And a medically referred accident, where you're sending somebody to a doctor, that the average is $40,000. So the costs can be much higher. That Chicago University of Chicago report that was 8,800 and change was really just an average based on all employees and a percentage being substance abusers. But it just takes one very tragic accident like that Amtrak report from 2016 that we talked about that could cause a small business to go out of business, to go bankrupt. The challenge here is that employers don't necessarily, they can't claim that their drug test program is going to prevent everyone from not being at work under the influence of drugs. But it shows a good faith effort on the part of the employer to be able to say, we did pre-employment testing, we do random testing with our safety sensitive workers, we have specific regulations in place to prevent them or to deter drug use and prevent them from being under the influence on the job. And if ever legally challenged, it shows on the part of the employer a good faith effort to maintain a drug-free workforce.
Well, and I'll add, because I know DISA talks about this in a couple different presentations, there's also a lot of hidden costs from lower productivity to increased workers' comp claims or increased absenteeism that you get from someone who's actively abusing drugs.
Yeah, that's a great point, because employers sometimes look at the cost of the drug test as the cost of their drug-free workplace program. But in reality, you've got all these other sort of soft dollar things that are happening behind the scenes. Like you said, a drop in productivity, accidents that don't necessarily, send somebody to the hospital, but they interfere with the flow of work for the day. And all of those things add up and cost employers dollars every single day.
It's the age-old an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, right? Exactly. So how do you know if the kind of treatment an employee needs, or how do you know what kind of treatment an employee needs if you want to offer them a second chance agreement?
Do you want to take that one, Yvette?
Yeah, so the employer is not themselves going to want to determine that. They need to send the employee to a substance abuse professional who can do an evaluation and put together a treatment plan. And then the second chance agreement is going to be that the employee needs to follow the treatment plan that the professional is recommending. And depending on what professional you get, it can be extremely detailed, like we looked at with the DOT follow-up testing. They can recommend how often the person needs to be tested, follow up after their treatment, that sort of thing. So you're going to let a substance abuse professional determine, you know, what those kinds of conditions are. Of course, the employer can add conditions that have to do with the workplace or their duties and that sort of thing. But the treatment plan is going to come from a professional.
Okay. And then does an employer have to standardize their second chance program for everyone, or can they just offer it to the employees they want to keep?
Yeah, step one, you're going to want to consult the state laws where you're operating and find out, you know, if the laws speak to that. If the laws don't mention it, if it's kind of open, a lot of the state laws are going to leave that to the employer's discretion. Then you know, there's a possibility of just offering that to certain employees, but you do want to be careful. If your policy is not standardized, you have more of a risk of accusations of bias or discrimination, or actual bias or discrimination happening in the workplace. So it may be possible in many states, but you want to consider if that's really what you want to do, or if you want to have a standardized policy just to make sure that there's fair treatment happening across the board.
Okay. And then one last question. You mentioned that Maine and Vermont require second chance agreements. If an employee tests positive and doesn't want to go to substance abuse treatment, can you terminate their employment?
Yes, both Maine and Vermont do allow if the employee who tests positive is offered the chance to go to treatment or rehabilitation and they refuse and they don't want to, then their employment can be terminated.
Okay, awesome. Bill, Yvette, thank you again so much for coming out today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, no, extremely impactful information. And I know the audience will get a lot out of it. So thank you again. And to the audience, thank you for coming and spending some time with us today. We hope to see you in many of the other sessions going on this week for Day with DISA. Bye-bye.